crazy night in downtown Richmond on a Friday. We're so glad that you've chosen to spend a little time with us this evening for what I think is the important continuation of a conversation that began at the beginning of this town. The unresolved, you can hear me, the unresolved issues that are still present. You know, one of the things that's recently happened to me is with the passing of my mother, I began to realize that she was gone, but things remained. And I think that as a city, we often try to openly forget. And the fact of the matter is, as much as we try to forget, the strength of those stories that are left continue. So whether it's a family story, a personal story, a story hidden in a museum or in a family attic, a story that Richmond tends to have this thing about we just bury and remove the things that discomfort us. So whether we are in Shockoe Bottom or Monument Avenue, there are the challenges that remain have nothing to do with what's removed and hidden. And so the next couple months this summer, we're going to be taking a look at some of those hidden places and hidden stories. And we are happy at the Valentine to be a supporter of what is an amazing, amazing team. Reclaiming the Monument is a project, and where are they? Is Alex? I know Alex and Dustin, where are you? They're doing the work. But Reclaiming the Monument has been a real honor and a privilege for us to work with, supporting that project with the Mellon Foundation. And particularly this series of activities this summer called Recontextualizing Richmond, that will do 5 additional of these installations around the city. So there'll be 6 total. This is an evening of partners, and I hope that you will see lots of folks along the way from Untold RVA, and I know Free is at the White House of the Confederacy at this very moment, who's part of the Keepers of the Light in Sastre Portal, and there'll be a ceremony at the White House. The American Civil War Museum and its stewardship of the White House. And I will just add an extra thanks to VCU for letting sort of putting up with us as we, it's on the way to the emergency room where the projections are happening. And so they've been very accommodating in making this all happen. So we need you. We need you involved in this process. And so you'll see folks with flashing buttons, I've got mine somewhere, passing out these bookmarks, and on the back is a QR code. That's part of a survey that we're doing over the entire summer, because we'd love to have this data to compare as we begin to think about the spot and story behind us. So what you find behind us is, I think, one of the more interesting, significant, troubled places where the doors are hidden, right? It's the Edward Valentine studio. And in this studio, we know that Jefferson Davis came. And we know that in this building, the iconography of the lost causes are created. And as an institution, we hold that as an important now opportunity, responsibility, challenge to begin to understand what happened in this place, what happened in the Valentine Museum after its founding. Because the issues we're dealing today are partially responsibility, and we're partially responsible for. We created some of these issues. And this is the moment for us to begin to think critically about our institution and our legacy. And so I hope that over the summer, that this is the beginning of a very, very long process. As you know, many of you that are associated with the Valentine, we've been working on this for a long time. but I think that the events of 2020 have reminded us of the urgency of the work that many of us already are doing in this community. And so I've gone on much too long because I was supposed to do the shortest introduction ever. But I think it's important for us to think about that tonight. Think about that person, that place where in Richmond we have removed something, someone who's lost from your life, that's lost from your space. And what are the stories that need to be told before they're forgotten? Intentionally, unintentionally, this is the important work that we all need to do as a community. So please fill out your survey, and we're so excited to introduce our team who will lead us through the discussion this evening.
That's mine. I was gonna get up here and just kind of wing it at that point. It's like, well. But yes, thank you all again, and thank you, Bill, for those awesome remarks. Good evening, and thank you for joining us as we discuss some of Richmond's untold history within the White House of the Confederacy. My name is Stephanie Merlot, and I am the Community Outreach and Organization Director for Reclaiming the Monument. We also have Dustin Klein, who is our Technical Director, and Alex Cricky, who is our Creative Director, both who are actually over at the Executive Mansion setting up for an amazing reveal of our newest artwork by Miguel, and I'll go into that here in a little bit. So Dustin Klein and Alex, they were the founders of Reclaiming the Monument during the wake of the death of George Floyd. With the use of a peaceful and non-destructive medium of light, they hoped that they could amplify the voices of the movement around them, which resulted in their projection work on the Robert E. Lee Monument at Marcus Davis Peters Circle, which quickly became a beacon to help keep attention to the reclamation that was taking place in the former capital of the Confederacy. Our goal is to continue to address the neglected historical and social narratives in our community here and around the world, but through projection-based art and to help put the tools, knowledge, and skills we utilize in our work into the hands of others so they can create greater access to utilizing light as a peaceful means of protest and resistance. Firstly, I do want to thank those who helped make this project happen, beginning with the Mellon Foundation and Culture Works, who provided us with a grant to ensure we continue our work. We also want to thank the Valentine Museum, the American Civil War Museum, Untold RVA, as well as Grace for the floral arrangements. Thank you. Lastly, we do want to thank Miguel Carter Fisher, whose newest artwork, titled Vision of Mary Jane Richards, will be unveiled at the end of this panel discussion. That will also provide us with, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, but that painting is going to be of Mary Jane Richards, who we will be discussing during this panel discussion as well. So tonight we do have some amazing panelists here that will help guide us through these stories of espionage, loyalty, advocacy, and turmoil. Tonight we have Anna Edwards, Kelly Hancock, Stephanie Arduini, all from the American Civil War Museum. And we also have Dr. Laurinette Lee from the University of Richmond and Justin Reed from Virginia Humanities. So before we actually get into the panel discussions, we are going to start off with Dr. Laurinette, who is going to read us a poem titled The Slave Auction, which is written by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Dr. Laurinette.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for being here, and to our host and all those who made this night possible, as well as the universe, who's given us a perfect evening together. This poem by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was written in 1854. She herself was a free black woman. She was born in Baltimore and she died in Philadelphia. She was also an activist in every sense of the word She championed abolition, civil rights, women's rights, and temperance. And her poetry in several volumes speaks to the experience of the enslaved people. This particular poem speaks to the experiences of slave mothers, the slave auction. The sale began. Young girls were there, defenseless in their wretchedness, whose stifled sobs of deep despair revealed their anguish and distress. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries, while tyrants bartered them for gold. And woman with her love and truth, for these in sable forms may dwell, gazed on the husband of her youth with anguish none may paint or tell. And men whose sole crime was their hue, the impress of their maker's hand, and frail and shrinking children too were gathered in that mournful band. Ye who have laid your love to rest and wept above their lifeless clay, know not the anguish of that breast, whose loved are rudely torn away. Ye may not know how desolate are bosoms rudely forced to part, and how a dull and heavy weight will press the life drops from the heart. The slave auction.
Thank you for that. That was a very powerful poem that you read, and I'm unsure about how you might have felt, but the immediate feelings that I was feeling when you read that were just, I just felt sadness and anger, and it's really all I can say. It's really all I can say. Right now, what we are going to do, we are going to have Anna Edwards with the American Civil War Museum to do an introduction of the Executive Mansion.
Okay. All right. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having us and letting us, sort of share in this conversation. It's been an interesting journey to have come to the museum and learn the history of this house and learn what it meant to give tours of the house, when the truth is that only a few years before that, I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to walk into the building. I remember approaching the corner and seeing the markers out front and reading them and feeling a real sort of hardness and a kind of resentfulness, actually. And I would just turn away. So when I started giving the tours, I went through an adjustment. I decided to be practical, and I went through an adjustment of saying this is just an empty house that had some people in it, that lived certain lives, that did certain things, and there isn't any reason for me to let this house scare me or prevent me from being able to think and have a way of being here. So the history of the house itself is a 200-plus-year-old history. It was created, or it finished completion in 1818, and it was the house of a very wealthy couple, the Brokenbrough family. They themselves were each, Mr. Brokenbrough and his wife, Gabriella Harvey, were both from very prominent, wealthy families. So they were automatically and intrinsically bringing with them the culture of early 19th century and truthfully, late 18th century, the wealth of the planter class. They were building a townhome in a neighborhood that was very prominent. John Marshall was a neighbor, and they were not far from the Capitol building, and it was a fairly new building, and this was a fairly new capital city. In that period, it had not yet become what we describe as the second largest slave trading city in the country, domestic slave trading country, domestic slave trading capital. But it would soon be on that trajectory. For the first 20 years of its existence, it was simply a residence for this family. And then when they sold it, there were three successive owners. One of them was a man named James Seddon, who didn't live here very long, but he would end up serving in the Confederate government when this did become the capital of the Confederacy. So he lived in that house for a few years. And then when he and his wife sold it, it was to a man named Lewis Crenshaw. And he and his wife expanded the house. He was a very prominent merchant. He owned flour mills and other businesses. He owned a wool factory that was on the site of the Tredegar Iron Works, where we have our main museum located. He was very, very smart man. As far as I can determine, he was, I say this to the guests, he was wealthy before, during, and after the war. So he was one of those business brains who figured out how to ride those things out. But they had redone the house, and then they were the ones who were at some point prevailed upon to sell the house to the city so that it could become the executive residence of the Davis family when they came to Richmond. They were there for 4 years. No, not even. 3 years and 8 months, I think, was their sum total existence in that house. And yet, the characterization of that house is that it was the White House of the Confederacy. And the language, the White House of the Confederacy, was part of the intentional memory making around that place later in the 20th century. And so originally it was the Gray House, it was the President's House, it was the Broken Bow House, it was the Crenshaw House. Kind of whoever you were when you lived here, you would remember some association with it. Each of those households, even though we don't have documentation that specifically says this, was a household, again, of the period, of the era. These were wealthy people. Their servants were enslaved people for the vast majority of that time. If there were a handful of free servants, that was also a part of the landscape. But they were enslavers all the way through, the Crenshaws and then the Davises. And so this house, even though it was the capital of the Confederacy in terms of the executive residence of the Confederate first family, and built up a huge amount of sort of public cachet or as sort of a feeding trough for memory making in later years, it went on to become United States military headquarters for 5 years during Reconstruction. Part of the Freedmen's Bureau was managed out of it. It then became a public school, a segregated school for white children for about 22, 23 years after that. And then it became the Confederate Museum. So throughout its history, it has served as really not shell, what am I looking for? A container for sort of the Southern, an elite Southern perspective on what our society is and how it should be structured. Even when it became a museum, it really took that path as well, because it modeled itself and it promoted itself as a shrine-like place. So the changes to that and our ability now to sort of transform it, I think sits in the realm of our responsibility, and I think projects like this are giving us, we had begun changing the stories and the narratives actually quite a while ago, but more intentionally now, and then opening it up to these kinds of interpretive uses, I think is going to help do that as we go forward. So.
Thank you so much. And it's such a long history as well. I mean,
204 years?
Yeah, that sounds long. Yeah. It's quite some time. All right, well, thank you so much for that. Now, that should paint a picture and give you kind of an idea of where we're going. And with our next question, we are going to just dive right into these panel questions. And then once we're done, we're going to leave time for questions that you might have. So if they are popping up as you go along, jot them down, put them in your phone, or keep them up here. And definitely ask whenever we are, as we are concluding our panel. So this question is for Dr. Laurinette Lee. Now, what would the broader landscape of urban enslavement in Richmond have looked like, and how does it compare to the reality which exists inside the Executive Mansion?
Thank you for that, Stephanie. Oftentimes when people think about slavery, they're thinking about the plantations. But when we consider urban slavery, we have to look at the built environment as well. There were factories here, there were merchants, and we cannot forget Shockoe Bottom and how close we are to Shockoe Bottom, the second largest domestic slave trading center. When you recall the poem, The Slave Auction, think about how close we are to that. We actually could walk to Shockoe Bottom. And to have that as a part of the reality, the dailiness of the city, is difficult to really realize, to understand that that was a central organism of industry. We also know that there were not only enslaved people, but free black people mingling easily with poor whites and elite whites. A lot of the slave owners would rent or lease their workforce to the Richmond area. And those enslaved people had a great deal of mobility because their slave owners were not here, but they were sending whatever monies were made back to their slave owner, and the slave owner was also receiving money from whoever releasing these enslaved people. Oftentimes these enslaved people would keep some of the money to help free their family members as well. So there's a lot of movement going on throughout the city. There's also a lot of movement going on within the domestic space as well. Both enslaved and free blacks are living, coexisting with their enslavers. And these enslaved people, as well as free black, are realizing this rhetoric about a revolutionary experiment, a new America, has left them out, but they continue to push toward that ideal of being free. And when we talk about free blacks, oftentimes people think that their position is a lot better than the enslaved people. They actually had a very difficult time as well. Their mobility was restricted. Laws were created that they too could not be educated. And so the free black individuals would form communities where there was some safety within a slave society. But oftentimes, if not all the time, parents were always concerned about their children because they could often be kidnapped and sold into slavery, as well as free black adults as well. So they always had to carry their freedom papers on them. And if they were enslaved, they needed to have a pass saying who they belonged to, sometimes descriptions of what they looked like, where they were going. And so we're looking at actually a schizophrenic society. Mm-hmm. And it's something that we see playing out in our contemporary lives now.
Yes, I agree. I agree 100%. Thank you so much for that. Anna, can you tell us about William A. Jackson and how he came to have his likeness appear in Harper's Weekly and other publications across the North?
So William Jackson was a man who was enslaved and rented by the Davises from his owner in Richmond. And William Jackson was part of the household, I want to say, for about 8 months. I think that's about right. Yeah. So about 8 months. And his job has been described variously as coachman, also as someone who waited at the dinner table, And he probably performed different functions at different times. But we know about William Jackson because he left. He got word, probably from his wife or circulating within his owner, that he was likely to be sold south. And rather than be sold south away from his family, he decided to escape and headed for Union lines. As far as we can tell, most likely he headed towards Fort Monroe. And Fort Monroe was well established by that time. It had been under the command of General Butler. He is most known, I think, in terms of the episodes we might call the black chapters of the Civil War, as the general who figured out the contraband, the use of the contraband policy to define enslaved or runaway enslaved people and how to protect them from being taken back by their owners. In any event, William Jackson made his escape, and he ended up going to up north and traveling and speaking about his experiences. He ended up traveling in Europe for a little bit and part of an abolitionist organization speaking to the issue of the war and abolition. And ultimately, he did come back to the United States, and he did, after the war, we find records that have him running for office, attending a training school, and basically living out his life in New England. He ends up in the newspapers, I think, principally because he was the coachman of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. And when black people were escaping or running away or self-emancipating, but certainly somebody who self-emancipated from the Confederate executive mansion, this was newsworthy, right? So most people who escaped to a military line would be interviewed certainly by an officer there, because they wanted to find out what they knew or didn't know, how they came to be there, and whatever incidental information they might have. They began to refer to this information as black dispatches because they were coming so frequently. And then, after being interviewed by the military, people were very often interviewed by the newspapers because, of course, in that period, and like any period, you want to know what's going wrong on the other side. That makes good press on your side. And so somebody escaping from the Confederate mansion is going to be newsworthy in northern newspapers. And as they are trying to continue or build morale,
just hope, Dustin and Alex aren't in the way right now. Very well.
okay. Fingers crossed. Yeah. So anyway, just to say that that it was good for morale in the U.S. to find out that things might be crumbling in the executive mansion, and therefore people like William Jackson are going to be interviewed. And his interview was pretty substantive. It was a full-on interview with his image in Harper's Weekly, and it circulated very widely. So it is something that you can look up online and read for yourself as well.
Thank you so much for that. He has such an interesting story, too.
Stephanie, may I add also?
You
he
sure
came
can.
from Hanover County at about the age of 15, and then he was leased to Jefferson Davis, I believe. And so when you think about young people, even in our time, being separated from their family, they have a need to get back or reconnect as best they can. And oftentimes when we hear about these people who are called runaways, they usually try to get back to their families.
And that is a really good point, because we do find that in the advertisements a lot, is that they will report, an enslaver will report that they are looking for this person, and they will give a description, and they will say their family, their mother or their sister or their child is known to be located in a residence in Williamsburg, and therefore you might find them there. So they're very much aware of the damage that they are doing. and just talking about it in this, very, as you say, schizophrenic, inverted kind of way. That the very thing that would draw someone, their very ties to their own families, is something that can be used against them and ought to be used against them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And I'll chime in on that. There's a announcement that I found in the newspaper about a girl named Elmira, and it says that she has escaped, and that her mother worked at the I think they say Jeff Davis's house, because they didn't say Confederate White House, but at Jeff Davis's house. And it also said that she had been seen in the area around the medical college. So there's this one little snippet there about Elmira, and I keep thinking, I want to know who Elmira's mother was, because we don't know that. But evidently, the thought is she's trying to find her mother. She's going to try to go close to where her mother is working.
And it's interesting because she was 16, and her enslaver posted this advertisement with a $25 reward. And so you can see the transactional, I can't even say it's a relationship, situation that people are being placed in.
And I'll build on that just a little bit, because for some instances, like the example of Elmira, where we only have a hint of something, and it makes us ask more questions and want to know more about these people who we have a passing reference to. That's one thing that's really powerful about the story of William Jackson, is we have his story and his image in his own words. So for people who are professionally thinking about the stories we tell about the past and asking questions about what that means to us, it's such a privilege to have William Jackson's story and his words telling his own story. And that's not the case for everybody that we know who is enslaved or passed through that space.
And later in the war, James Pemberton, who was enslaved by Jefferson Davis, he ends up escaping. And one thing that James Pemberton says when he's interviewed by General Butler is he would like to find William Jackson, because he had just seen his wife and mentioned that Jackson's wife lived about 3 squares or about 3 blocks from the Jefferson Davis's house. So there's this wonderful example of James Pemberton, who's wanting to tell William Jackson, whom he formed probably a friendship with, give him a message from his wife, to get that word from a family member.
So that's going to lead me to this other, we talk, so as we discover characters and as we discover these figures, we talk about them and we try to know as much about each of them. And the more we talk, and especially over the last couple of years, I think, the more it's coming clear that we're also talking about friends and neighbors. These are people who knew each other. They lived nearby. They worked in the households, and if they were leased out, and this is a common practice, then they could be leased out to the same owners at different times. To find that James Pemberton wants to connect with Jackson because he's got news from home that he knows he's going to want. And later, when they're interviewed in the Anglo-African newspaper, they're also going to be referencing each other's experiences, in this house or on the streets, even I can't remember if they were actually on the streets in New York or in Hampton, but they have some post-Confederate President House experiences that they talk about as well. But again, this idea that many of these historical figures that we talk about and sort of put on these little silos of storytelling are actually people who knew each other. It's like if all of us, suddenly each had our stories being told, and then suddenly somebody discovered that you were the next door neighbor. And what? How can that be? And how do those stories intersect? And what did it mean that they knew that person on that particular day? It is the way in which corroborating evidences help us build the stories when we don't have specific information.
Absolutely. That was wonderful information. And, one thing that keeps standing out to me that you guys keep saying is the word lease. And it blows my mind. I mean, well, the fact that, I would lease a vehicle. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I would, lease a trailer to grab, to move, But to lease a person is just, I can't wrap my head around it.
So you could also think about day laborers today, right? So day laborers work for nowhere near enough money. And so in many ways, day laborers are tied to that job, having to come back every day because they will take the cost of their shoes or their equipment or their tools out of it. And like sharecropping, they're bound to this situation. They can never rise out of it.
Yeah.
And so it's another way to think about, leasing. And I use that, wow, all my smart words are slipping away this evening. But the idea that for people who live in the city, describing it as akin to car dealerships is very useful and probably pretty accurate, replication of that process,
Yeah.
right? But people who live in the country and are still living agricultural lives, they already know exactly what it is, and that's where the word chattel comes from, right? It is the same as the trading in livestock.
Mm. Wow. Anna, you were not Anna, Kelly. You were kind of talking about the Pembertons a little bit, so let's kind of go on that. So while we know that as the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond was the main military target for the United States Army during most of the Civil War. But how did these events of the war influence life inside the house, particularly in relation to the stories of William Jackson, Henry Moseley, and Jim and Betsy Pemberton and their path to freedom?
So basically, what we see, because William Jackson seizes his freedom in 1862 and goes north to where General McDowell was. So any time whenever the U.S. Army got closer to Richmond, that made more of an opportunity for enslaved people to escape, to seize their freedom. There's somewhere they can go. So William Jackson does that in 1862. And then in 1864, as you've got the army of the James, Butler's army just to the east, then this is where we see three individuals leave the Confederate White House. There's, first of all, James and Betsy Pemberton. And even though marriages between enslaved people were not legally recognized, it does seem like James and Betsy were a couple, and the Davises, in some level, recognized that. And James and Betsy were, James was a manservant or a body servant for Jefferson Davis, and Betsy was Varina's lady's maid. But they, in January of 1864, January 8th, they go east to where General Butler was. And then Butler was so impressed with the information that James Pemberton had about what was going on in the Confederate capital that he sent him up to Washington, D.C. to be interviewed by Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. So this happens January 8th, 1864, and then January 19th, there's an enslaved man named Henry Moseley who is working in the executive mansion. He's been rented out or leased from another owner. And Henry Moseley takes this opportunity to escape as well. And he ends up going east. The great thing about Moseley's story is that until just about a year ago, we didn't know what happened with Henry Moseley. In fact, we didn't even know he had a last name. We knew him as Henry because we have in our collection a pass for him. And so about a year ago, Dr. Jonathan White, who's from Christopher Newport University, was going through issues of the Anglo-African newspaper. And he came across the article and he said, I think this is something you might be interested in. So we learned that Henry Moseley was successful in his escape, and that he too went to Norfolk, just as James and Betsy had done. But you do see and not just with the enslaved people who worked at Jefferson Davis's house, but you see really wherever the U.S. Army is going throughout the war, there are these incidences of emancipation as enslaved people seize their freedom, as they go to the nearest U.S. Army and find protection with those troops.
Something I want to mention here, thank you for mentioning that, about James Pemberton, I believe. He was the one that Benjamin Butler said was of great integrity and courage, and he sent him on to the next military superior. But yet, when he does that, he says, I'm sending the boy.
Oh, yeah, he does.
And you can see how, even though Butler admires his courage and integrity, still thinks of him in a juvenile sense. And that was the way that slave owners, not only slave owners, but whites generally, thought of people of color, which still exist many ways today.
Oh yeah, just to share a story, at a job that I worked at, there was a young black man, and our supervisor, who was a middle-aged white man, they had a little disagreement. And as the young black man was walking away, he said, "Boy, get back here." And I just, I don't think people really understand how hard that hits and the disrespect that follows those words. And when I say that guy turned around so quick and went towards my supervisor, we had to take him away because of the audacity. He was just full of audacity. But yes, it is still something that people still do today. It is not okay. I wish more people were more aware of that kind of language and where it comes from and how it still affects people.
Yeah, and Stephanie, I just want to jump in real quick to maybe just
Absolutely.
kind of underline what's happening right now. I grew up, well, I was born here in Richmond, and then I grew up about 20 miles outside of Appomattox. So I always say I've been escaping the Confederacy my whole life, essentially, in those two places. But the thing that I think is really powerful about what's happening right here is because you all are really kind of showing us the next stage of how we interpret the role of Black Americans in the Civil War. Because if I think back to my childhood growing up near Appomattox, I mean, the narrative, even then was that enslaved people were happy, right? And we move forward and we see the conversation shift to say that Lincoln emancipated, all the enslaved people. And then I think only in the kind of the last decade or so in popular, consciousness have we begun to recognize the fact that there was a lot of self-liberation happening, right?
Yeah.
And, in addition to the colored troops, there was self-liberation happening. And I think what's so powerful about this moment is that not only are we saying that there was self-emancipation happening, but within the very seat of power of the Confederacy, Black people on the inside were helping to direct the outcome of the war. They were in the seat of Confederate power, and there were mysterious fires happening at the White House of the Confederacy. You have people writing about Mrs. Davis unable to keep a staff because people were constantly self-liberating themselves. So you have to think about what does that do to any leader when your quote-unquote team, this was an enslaved team, but you can't keep a team.
Right.
You can't keep employees. You can't keep your enslaved people here with you. And we know how reliant these enslavers were on the enslaved community. So I don't want us to leave here without really kind of emphasizing that point, that this is a shift and a really important shift in how we interpret Black people during the Civil War, going from the fact that we were able to self-liberate ourselves to we were helping direct the outcome of the war from within the seat of power of the Confederacy. And I think that's huge.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Thank you for bringing up that point. I mean, and some of it might have just been happening unknowingly too. You know, it's
Most of it.
yeah, you're right. You are right. Most of it was.
Stephanie, can I build on that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I kind of want to underline what you're saying, Justin, and connect it with what Kelly said earlier, just for some context for the Civil War. So the episode that happened at Fort Monroe, where 3 men go to Benjamin Butler under the cover of night and seek refuge from the United States military, that's happening just weeks after Virginia secedes, before the Battle of Manassas. So before some of these first things that we think of as the first shots of the war are really happening, Black people are seizing opportunities in that chaos to take their freedom and make it real for themselves. And Benjamin Butler is using these opportunities, and partly as a lawyer, as a way to wage war on one of those key elements of the Confederacy, which is their greatest strength and their greatest weakness is in the labor of enslaved people. So by undermining that, it's a tactic that Abraham Lincoln later builds on with the Emancipation Proclamation. But Black people aren't waiting for that. They're taking those opportunities and accelerating the pressure on the military and politicians to make that a policy and add that as a war aim for the United States during the Civil War.
That's really important to think about. And when I think about Mary Chestnut, who wrote a diary, I believe, about what was going on, white female, she referred to the enslaved people in the White House, the White House, as birds of passage, because they were leaving so frequently. And yet the Davises thought of these enslaved people as content, happy, satisfied to be working with the Davises. We know that Mrs. Davis was continually cruel, as a matter of fact. And that's the narrative that you don't ever hear about. And that's the narrative you don't hear about slavery. Mm-hmm. In order to keep people enslaved, violence was central. Mm-hmm. And deference was another tool that was in place. And when you consider how those tools were used to subordinate people, we can see in our own times how the resurgence of that has continually, sporadically been a part of American history. You think about the violence that occurred during Reconstruction, during what we call the Lost Cause era, but what we know of as the nadir, the lowest point for Black people, because lynchings were happening on such a regular basis. And at the same time, you get this installation of these Confederate monuments. Yeah. And when you ask yourself, well, what do these monuments mean? We need to get the full history, not just the history that was taught from the textbooks that were created during Lost Cause era.
Yeah, by the, we know that the Daughters of the Confederacy definitely had their hand in all of that for the most part, as much as they could. And you were, Lornette, when you were talking about, or it might have been Justin, when you were talking about how they really, the brutality against slaves, as if, they want to put fear in them, stop them from running away. When I was doing some research and I came across this article, and it was back from like 1850, possibly 1840, and it was a runaway slave from Petersburg. And when they caught him, they gave him 600 lashes, then held him down, poured water down his throat, and then gave him 200 more lashes. and like talking about it still makes me very emotional because when I read that, I was in the Library of Virginia and I read that and I was with Alex at the time and I just started to cry and I was like, how cruel could someone be? And how do you think that is going to make someone want to stay?
And oftentimes, these were public acts of
Yes.
violence to instill this fear in the larger community of not only enslaved but free blacks as well.
Get myself together. Thank you for that. Anna. Now, one of the fascinating things about the history of the house is how many of the free and enslaved people connected with the Davises go on to be involved in advocacy and civic engagement for abolitionism and, you see how that word I made up?
Yes.
Yeah. Abolitionism. Civil rights during and after the war. But can you talk about James Jones and what his story can tell us about the life for free black men in the South before and after the war?
So I'm going to refer to Kelly a couple of times just because I want to make sure I get some of the details of his after-war life correct. But James Jones is a really interesting character, and partly because of the way that his story evolved as I was giving the tours, because I used to simply say that James Jones he was one of the free black people that was employed at the White House of the Confederacy. And that we know he served as a driver for the family. We know that he was a body servant for Davis. He was from Raleigh, North Carolina, and he was trained in many trades, but he was a bricklayer, and he was somewhere in there. He also got trained to be able to be a body servant or a manservant. He was a driver. And when the Davis family, when they came to Richmond, somewhere in there, I think they bought a place in North Carolina or South Carolina because they would go for the summers. And when they would go for the summer, they still needed, servants. And so they hired James Jones, and they were so happy with his service that they asked him if he would continue on with them to Richmond, and he agreed. And so he comes to Richmond, and I think this was 1862, and he's with them for the rest of the war. After the war comes emancipation. Davis is off on his own journey through being incarcerated and charged with treason and facing various experiences before he is finally released. And James Jones returns home. And when he returns home as a free person. I mean, he's already free. And of course, here's one of the other interesting sort of paradigm shifts is that there's a whole sort of generational culture of being free black during slavery. And with emancipation, that framework simply goes away. James Jones returns home. He takes up his new role as a full citizen, because free black people were not full citizens. They did not have the right to vote in most places. And so he takes that on fully. He runs for office. He becomes an alderman in his community. He helps to start the first fire brigade in his community, and he goes on to a prominent civic service life. And yet, the story that I used to tell originally about him being in the house was that after the war, the next time we hear about James Jones is that he has offered to drive the carriage with Jefferson Davis's coffin in it upon his death, that he is so loyal and such a friend that he returns to do this, to offer this service in honor of Jefferson Davis and the family. And so in some ways I didn't tell this very well, because really I should have said all that up front, and then we go back and we say, but actually he had this whole other life that we just don't tell, because it's never been put together in his narrative as a value to be shared, to be told. that is not the part of his story that has any meaning to the narrative that has been crafted during the Lost Cause about the value of black people in relation to white people. And this became personal for me when one of my father's cousins shared with me a reprint of an account of a man called Uncle Jerry. And this place has a story as well. I'm drawing a blank, Christina. Henry Page. So here we have an Uncle Henry, right? So everybody becomes somebody's uncle or auntie. Uncle Henry was being touted, he was being praised by this man who was writing this piece to him. It was basically a supplement to an obituary. And he was describing how Uncle Jerry had been so loyal to this family, and he had been enslaved to this one woman and was with her until her husband went to the Civil War and was killed there. And then he went to another household and he stayed with them through the war. And then after the war, he stayed with them for 15 or 20 more years. And so his loyalty extended beyond freedom and emancipation because he's so utterly devoted to them. He has such affection. And they use words like affection and love, which again, just really, it's like the schizophrenia, right? And we should be mindful it's a flip use of a complicated mental health issue. But
America is complicated.
Well, there is
mental
that, right?
health issue. Excuse me.
So no, that's it, right? And so so they're telling this, and then literally at the end of this tribute to him, it describes that he is one of a generation of Negroes that we will not see again in our lifetime, and we will really miss them. And then it is signed, a white friend. So this is not underground stuff. This is out in the open. This is exactly, precisely, and openly how they feel. And yet my Uncle Jerry, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Jerry, had 2 families. He had, successively, but he had 10 children. He had a life. He had occupation. He had people that he was looking after while occupying this role over here for these people. And yet for them, that has nothing to do with his value in society or in life. Now, I'm not going to leave it there, because the truth is that for Jerry and for Henry, and who were we talking about originally? And James Jones. They were very clear who they were and what value they had in this world and to their families. And they lived their lives, and they carved them out in those spaces. But we should not, we have to understand the horrific nature of this aspect of, our society and how it has behaved. But we also have to remember that people found a way and made their way through that. As Reconstruction is being dismantled and people are finding themselves pushed back into subservient roles within society, they also still continue to build institutions. They built schools, and they built companies, and they bought property, and they created communities and attended churches and initiated the ways in which their communities could be created and sustained, right? So, again, the schizophrenia is like all over the place, right? But there have to be the places where we find hope. Right. And not just hope, but sort of a real recognition that on the ground people were doing things that we are also here as a result of.
And when we're talking about building lives, I like looking at, like James Jones' son became a physician. Ellen and her second husband, Frederick's daughter, became a teacher. William Jackson, his son, became a lieutenant in the U.S. Army. So you see these people taking advantage of like the freedom's first generation and see how they are carving out a life. And I love looking at that. And I think there's, is it Ellen's granddaughter? I think she also becomes a teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a
that
lot of that.
importance of education.
And I think that is where people found a lot of the hope in the schools that they created, in the teachers, in the ability to finally pursue education openly. We're beginning to learn that more enslaved and free Black people were literate than we had thought. But because it was illegal for them to be educated, they operated surreptitiously. Now, after the war, they're openly celebrating the fact that they too can receive an education. So the schools are crucibles of hope, really.
So just to, I mentioned that the house itself became a public school in the years after the war between 1872, 71, 72, and 1894. But there had been apparently maybe a momentary conversation about turning that into a school for Black children. And then they were like, no, actually we have another spot where we can build a school. And so just down the street, 12th Street at Lee Street, there was a 4-story school built, actually a beautiful building. So there was some money there in the Freedmen's Bureau. But a beautiful 4-story school that was for Black children and was named the Richmond Colored Institute, a Colored Normal Institute, normal referring to the curriculum to produce teachers. So they were, so they went there, and many of the people that you have heard of in Richmond's history went through that school. You've got Maggie Walker went through that school. John Mitchell Jr. went through that school. And probably a dozen other educators that people who work in the education system here in Richmond know very well. It's one of the areas where I feel really bereft of an education, because I learned how much people here in Richmond know their history. Black people here in Richmond know their history, and Black people in education know the history of Richmond and Richmond's educators. And many of the neighborhoods that we walk through are named after some of these early educators as well. So it's a powerful history that we also walk amongst, even as we walk amongst, Confederate memory markers.
And I'll say one thing kind of building on all of this is the kind of going back to James Jones as somebody who's participating in that civic process after the end of the war and during Reconstruction was something that was an official part of the Reconstruction process, making sure that Black people who had been enslaved or had been free Black people could participate in the process of rewriting state constitutions to admit former Confederate states back into the Union, to have that ability for self-determination for their communities and build those things and build those institutions and businesses that for them were key parts of what it meant to be free. And to me, looking at what freedom means, there's such a powerful window to look at people who had been denied freedom and what are those things that they choose to do when that freedom is theirs to shape. And if it's looking for family, seeking education, participating in government and forming a community, those are really, really powerful. And things that were legislated and official parts of Reconstruction, especially because Black people advocated for that. And if it had been assumed that, oh yeah, voting is totally part of what it means to be free, or being a citizen is totally what it means to be free, when those things were challenged and denied, it was the advocacy of Black people and their allies that required the governments, state, local, national, to clarify and protect those. So there's this moment, and James Jones' participation in shaping the Constitution of North Carolina is emblematic of that, of this shift about what does it mean to be part of this country? What rights do people have? And how do we reshape this nation in the way that the Civil War was this kind of second founding of our country as we're redefining what it means to be the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephanie, to continue with you, can you share with everyone, we're going to talk about a few new people here, who Ellen Barnes and Robert Brown were, and how their stories have been used by the Lost Cause narrative?
Sure. So Ellen Barnes and Robert Brown were two additional people in the House. And just for a little bit of context, We estimate there to be about a dozen staff at any one given time, just based on households of similar sizes and status. But we don't know. We don't necessarily know that because we have proof of every single person and every single role. But so you're hearing of some of them, but I want to just acknowledge that there could be others that we just don't know about, because we're looking for stories and finding evidence or finding references and things that are newly available to us because newspaper articles are digital, or we can get to archives that we couldn't get to before. So it's an evolving, ongoing process. But Ellen Barnes was another person who was hired out by the Davises in 1864. I'm looking at Kelly because Kelly has done some of the most extensive research on the servant staff in the house. She came also from Hanover County and operated, it seemed like, as a lady's maid to Varina and also kind of as a nanny to the children of the house, especially after the birth of Varina Ann Davis, or who was known as Winnie Davis, when she was born in 1864. And Robert Brown is interesting because he's also kind of a body man to Jefferson Davis, but he's one of the 3 people that we know that the Davises themselves owned and enslaved and brought with them to Richmond. There could be more, but we know of 3. So the Pembertons and Robert Brown. And Robert Brown is interesting because he, in so many ways, embodies the stories of so many people who were enslaved and passed through Richmond. So he was born into slavery here in Virginia, in Norfolk.
Yeah.
Yep. And so then he was sold south, and right before the Davises moved to Richmond to kind of assume that position as Confederate president, it seems like somewhere right around in there they purchased Robert Brown in somewhere in the Deep South. We don't exactly remember. But they bring him here. And so to me that asks a lot of questions about what might it have been like for Robert Brown, having been from Virginia and been on this journey and coming back. What might that have made him felt? Did he know? Did he remember? Was it something that felt familiar? Was it something that felt really scary or intimidating or complicated? But those 2 people we know a little bit more about. We actually have photographs of Ellen Barnes and of Robert Brown. We also have photos of James Jones. Those are the 3 people that we have pictures of that weren't just the sketching of William Jackson. And we have a little bit more detail on their life after the war. And I want to back up for just a second and talk about the Lost Cause, which was a form of memory about the Civil War that was defined and shaped by ex-Confederates and folks who ascribed to that. It was not the only system of memory or the only narrative of memory after the war, but it becomes the most pervasive and the most directly influential of how so many of us have experienced it in pop culture. And one of the key elements of the Lost Cause is basically not seeing Black people, saying that they were unprepared for freedom, that slavery was good for them, as Justin was kind of mentioning, and really only finding stories of Black people after emancipation when they were loyal or subservient. And because Ellen Barnes and Robert Brown, after the war, had these ongoing relationships with the Davis family, a lot of the time we had seen that these stories had been held up as examples of a loyal Black person. So Ellen Barnes, who, as the Davises were fleeing, she's with them. She eventually goes with the family to Montreal for a little bit while they're taking refuge there. She was introduced to her first or second husband? Second husband by Varina Davis. It's this weird relationship. And at one point, actually, Kelly, I'm going to toss this to you. Can you mention the reporter that talked to Ellen Barnes?
So what happens is after Jefferson Davis is captured, he's taken to Fort Monroe, and everybody goes by boat to Fort Monroe, but Varina and the children are going to be sent to Savannah and placed under house arrest there. And you get the sense when you read Varina's memoirs that, what she says is that Ellen was forced to come ashore at Fort Monroe by her husband. Her husband, Charles, had fled there about a year before. So, Varina's take on it is that she was forced. Whatever the fact is, Ellen goes ashore there to meet her husband at Fort Monroe, and she was actually interviewed by a correspondent from the New York Times. And so it's this really interesting interview. But in the course of that, the reporter asked her, about Mrs. Davis, and of course Ellen says something like she was good and all that. I'm looking at Anna because Anna quotes it a lot too, but she says, "I never want to go south as a slave again." So she makes this very clear declaration of the fact that she wants to be free, and that she, even though Mrs. Davis might be good, not good enough for me to continue to be a servant to her.
Yeah, the question was, we noticed, all right, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit of it because I don't remember all of it, but basically we noticed that you seem to get along with Mrs. Davis, so if things were different, would you return to bonded service with her? That was the question.
She
So it's
said,
interesting.
Oh no, sir, I'd much rather not.
Yeah, I'd much rather be free.
And
Yeah.
for the longest time, we're hearing these stories about Ellen Barnes and the way that she continued her relationship. She went with the Davises here or there, but we didn't include, or people hadn't included that story of, in her own words, of no. She might have been nice to me, but no, I'm not going to do that anymore.
And I will say, it was a story that I came across, I don't remember how many years ago now it's been, probably sometime around 2013 or something, that it was not something that was in our files. And just like we didn't know what happened with Henry, because so much more is being digitized, it was just, like it was finding gold to have this story and have Ellen being quoted. So, her own words, or at least her own words through a reporter.
And we have stories of Robert Brown because after the war, he kind of comes and goes, but he ends up living in Colorado with Jefferson Davis's eldest daughter, Maggie, and her family. And there are photos of him with Jefferson Davis's brother and Davis's kids. And there's some stories here and there that suggest some sort of closer or complicated relationship or some kinds of loyalty, and those stories have been spun and used. But Robert Brown is an interesting person to me because there's just so much we don't know. And his story, I think, it also, to me, suggests questions of what does freedom look like for people after the war? How do people look at their own lives and their own past that they need to take and make the choices that are right for them? And what was it about Robert Brown and his situation that made him feel like going and living with Davis's eldest daughter was the best path for him? And we don't know, but I think it's a good reminder of how, just like we're all different people with our own personalities, our own life situations, our own challenges that direct our choices that we make, Robert Brown is an example of somebody who had this ongoing kind of intertwining path with the Davis family to the end of his life. But we have these stories that have been held up as examples without all of those complications and nuance until fairly recently. And it's great when we can get more resources to add in complications or even answer some old questions or ask some new ones.
And I'll just chime in here as we're talking about the lost cause and kind of stories that are out there. I brought some visual aids, or some aids, I'll say, since I spent half my career working with children. I kind of felt that was necessary. But this is, I'll hold this up. There's a sketch of Robert Brown. But I'll read this, just the end of this article. This is 1893, and a lot of time, most of the stories that we have of Robert Brown and James Jones, these stories appear in the newspapers when something happens with the Davises. So, for instance, when Jefferson Davis dies in 1889, or this one, 1893, is when he was reinterred. But this is from the New Orleans Picayune, 1893, and at the very end of the article, this is what they say about Robert. Robert called to pay his respects to Miss Winnie Davis yesterday and is very proud of the fact that he belonged to the family. He is not altogether reconstructed and is not a very firm believer in the glories of emancipation. He is an intelligent old fellow and is an interesting talker. So that's just kind of one example. And it's not just the Southern newspapers. There's something from the Chicago Tribune in May of 1867. This is when Jefferson Davis was right before he was released from Fort Monroe. And as Stephanie kind of mentioned, Ellen Barnes, there at Fort Monroe, by 1867, her first husband, Charles, is dead. And Varina has now come to Fort Monroe to live with Jefferson Davis and brought with her a body servant that she had hired, Frederick McGinnis, who had been enslaved by General Beauregard. And Ellen and Frederick McGinnis end up getting married. So this wedding was covered because these are two servants of the Davises being married. And so with Ellen, it says, when after the evacuation of Richmond, the family were compelled to move southward, Ellen could not be persuaded to leave them, but faithfully shared with them the toll and suffering of those fearful days. So just kind of an example of the way, this kind of loyalty was held up, and the way Ellen and Robert Brown and James Jones were talked about.
Historians read those and you ask questions like, okay, where is this? Where could there be seeds of truth and evidence? But also, who's writing? What were the situations that some of these interviews happened? Because these are not necessarily their words there, or they were edited, and so there's filters to that. So finding newspapers are wonderful tools, but as you've heard us say a little bit before, they often just make us ask more questions, and we're really trying to triangulate a lot of this to find some answers.
Absolutely. Thank y'all. So we have a couple more questions. We are getting close to our time, and I want to make sure that we give these fine folks a chance to ask any questions that they might have. So, Laurinette, if you can kind of tell us about who Mary Jane Richards was, which we will we'll see an unveiling of a portrait of her, a painting of her here soon. But if you could tell us about how did she come to be involved in espionage in Richmond, and specifically the Executive Mansion.
Okay. Mary Jane Richards is also known as Mary Bowser. Many people might know of her from children's books. I believe there was a television or a mini movie about her. She was once owned by Elizabeth Van Lew, who was a white female Quaker, came from Philadelphia, I believe. And Elizabeth freed Mary, sent her north to get an education. And from there, she sent her to Liberia as part of the American Colonization Society. That was a difficult transition for Mary, and she did not want to stay there, and so Elizabeth sent for her to come back here to Virginia. And it was said she was very intelligent, and Elizabeth saw the opportunity for her to become part of a spy ring. Well, people said that Elizabeth Van Lew had this spy ring. And Mary Bowser was able to infiltrate the White House of the Confederacy, and apparently to see documents that Jefferson Davis had and pass this knowledge on to Elizabeth Van Lew. And it said that Elizabeth would wake up in the morning and say, Mary, what news do you have for me? She eventually left there, was on the speaker circuit, and also started a school, moved around quite a bit. She was not one to stay in one place long and assumed several aliases. And oftentimes with her telling of her history, the story would change. And so we know her as Mary Bowser, but there are several other names that she goes by as well.
Did you want to add something, Kelly? Oh, no, sorry. I thought you were fixing to say something. I'm sorry.
I was looking at Anna. I thought Anna might want to add something. I was
Sure.
going to let Anna.
Okay. Yeah, so, Mary's story is compelling, kind of like Robert's and James in for what we don't know, right? And we know so much less about Mary than legend would have us believe, right? So as far as we can tell from the records that exist at this moment, if she was in that house, she was there once. And she went and made inquiries. This is according to her, to a reporter telling about a speaking engagement that she participated in, I think in New York or Philadelphia. It was in New York, yeah. And so basically, she tells the story that she presented herself at the house and inquired after washing. So either to pick up washing or to offer herself as a washerwoman. And that while she was there, she was asked to wait in a small parlor. And the description that they give fits as close as anything to a small corner room when you first walk into the house and turn right. It's described as either a library or reception room. And that while she was in that room, she decided, she's left alone, to rifle through the desk that was there. There was a small desk. We believe it was Davis's desk because he did sometimes use that room as a place to work. And that while she was going through the papers to see if there was anything interesting in there, that he walked in. And then apparently promptly walked out again. Just didn't think anything of it. And then as far as we can tell, she then left after that. So it's possible she took something with her and passed that information on. We don't know for sure. But that is actually the only account that comes close to her own words describing her espionage activity at the White House of the Confederacy, right? And yet she has become legendary according to stories that were initiated long after, well, actually not that long after her passing, but long after the Civil War. I'm going to say before 1910, there was an account that was printed by someone, a man named Thomas McNiven, who said that he was in Richmond and was a part of this espionage ring and could attest to. The problem is that the stories of McNiven are not actually even coming directly from him. They're coming from his daughter or grandniece? Nephew?
I don't know,
right.
They
yeah.
weren't recorded until the 1950s. And, if you know family history, you probably have stories in your family that have been passed down. And I know I remember seeing my grandmother and great-grandmother argue about stuff, and my grandmother shaking her head saying, no, never happened, never happened. My great-grandmother just did.
So here we have, and so, okay, the stories about Mary Bowser being, having a photographic memory, having been embedded in the in the Confederate president's house for the entire 4 years of the war, and having been this miraculous font of information passing through Elizabeth Van Lew to the Union Army, and I'm sure that it's been said that she helped win the war, right? And so the problem with having a mythology arise around someone is that you lose what she actually did. And what Mary actually did is incredibly impressive. Her 6 years in Liberia, unable to come home, right? I mean, she was sent off there after she was educated. We don't know anything about that period of her life. She was from age 14 to approximately age 20. It's pretty formative. And then she comes back to Richmond, and super compressing the story, she ends up helping out in this espionage activity getting messages out of prison camps and out and moving messages around town, helping do that kind of work, possibly, having an encounter. Maybe she had more than one encounter. We don't know. As Laurinette was saying, many aliases. I mean, she changes her name so often, and whether she does it because she's getting ready to do a show and she wants to call herself Richmonia Richards, because that sounds good on the flyer, right? Or because she is having to masquerade as an enslaved person when she's actually a free person, and that is not a welcome bit of information in Richmond. Whether or not it's because she is serving a particular role as a spy, or because her name was a different. Anyway, Mary is an elusive person, and she seems to carry that with her through the last of the letters that we know about her. She is elusive. And then because she's elusive, and because someone has crafted these stories about her, she kind of becomes, again, like I was saying about the house being a container, she becomes a container for what we need her to do for us. The stories that we need her to carry for us, right? Robert Brown's kind of the same way. James Jones is the same way. What we don't know about them allows us to fill in the gaps in a way that we need, or somebody needs at a given moment. And so I think we're still wrestling with that that idea with Mary.
Thank you so much for that.
And I was just going to jump in and say one thing
Absolutely.
more about Mary.
There's always
We don't know how she looked. There's no photograph of her. There's no sketch of her. And there is a photograph that's out there that's circulated widely that was taken in early 19-teens kind of. It's not Mary Bowser, but it's, people say that it is. You see it on the internet as Mary Bowser. So I think maybe that's another reason why there's, maybe so much mystery around her, is because nobody knows how she looked.
It is a Mary Bowser, just not this Mary Bowser.
Not
that
this
we're talking
Mary
about.
Bowser.
A different Mary Bowser from Petersburg.
And I guess just real quickly with the Bowser, she did marry a man, Wilson Bowser, in 1861 at St. John's Church. So even though she was originally Mary Jane Richards, she's very briefly Mary Bowser, but by the end of the war, it doesn't seem like they're married anymore. You don't hear of Wilson Bowser, so there's that other mystery of like what happened with that relationship.
And so there's always going to be something to add, right? But so there is probably lore or stories that come through the Bowser family. Wilson Bowser, he was married to her, and at a certain point, the family, I'm certain, would feel some connection to her and potentially some relationship to the stories that are told about her as well.
There's she, from what is known, she seems like an extraordinary, resilient person, and I hope that we learn more about her as time goes on. I don't know if we will, but it would be really cool to just see how her story starts to unfold, and her stories adding to the narrative of helping bring down the Confederacy. That would be pretty awesome. Richmonia Richards. All right, so Justin, now how can we improve our landscape of historic memory in Richmond to make sure that stories like the ones we have been discussing aren't lost among the far easier to talk about subjects of war and generals and statues to so-called great men?
This is my question.
Yeah.
And let me say this
I
though.
just
I'm happy to have. I'm honored to have been kind of the gender diversity kind of token man on the panel today.
And then I wanted to ask you about great men.
And I told them this too. Laurinette is a mentor of mine, and I've known Anna for several years, whose work I'm a great admirer of. So I already told them ahead of this that I really just wanted to listen to hear them speak, and they insisted that I join them on stage. But I think one of the first steps to really rethinking public history and public memory is almost doing exactly what I just did. Sometimes you have to listen, especially if you've historically held power. You have to ensure that you aren't continuing to hold all the power. You have to be willing to share that power. And so I think when it comes to public history, one initial step is for those institutions and organizations that have traditionally crafted the narrative to take that back seat and be able to listen to the voices that have been historically suppressed and oppressed. So I think that's an important step. I mean, I think for the work that my organization does, where we're supporting a lot of these efforts around the state, and I think one of the biggest needs that I've found is that we simply need to resource the organizations, especially the grassroots organizations and the Black-led organizations that are doing this work. And we have to resource them in a way that is equitable, right? That is reparative and makes up for the generations where funding has not existed or been contributed to the organizations. But we also have to resource those organizations with no strings attached.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think that's something that even, particularly white funders have a hard time doing when it comes to supporting Black and Brown-led work. There are always these strings attached, or we're attempting to force them through our stolen wealth. And I say our, I mean, I'm talking about white stolen wealth. There's this attempt to try to really still pull the strings and push the work in a certain direction based on the wealth that you've inherited.
Yeah.
That, in all actuality, has been stolen.
Yeah.
But I think, ultimately, the work is happening when I look at what Free is doing with Untold RVA, or when I look at what Folklore Society is doing, or Anna, what you're doing in Shockoe Bottom. I mean, the work is happening. The question is, will we allow and support the organizations that are already doing the work to do it? And I think that's what we've yet to see. We still put up these unnecessary barriers and the red tape and all of these excuses to prevent the work from happening, when more than anything we simply need to let it happen and let those who are on the ground do it, versus always trying to institutionalize it or throw in the government bureaucracy or even, as I said earlier, attaching strings to the funding. But I think for audiences, I mean, this is a somewhat diverse audience, but I guess I want to speak to white audience members and Richmonders in general. I think a major shift that has to first occur is this idea that elevating Black voices and brown voices is somehow an attempt to erase white voices. Like, we have to shift beyond this zero-sum scarcity mindset. We have to be able to recognize that no one is saying that the Davises didn't live in the White House of Confederacy. No one's ever going to say that. We're not going to pretend like they never lived and didn't exist. But they don't necessarily have to be the sole focus of that interpretation. And frankly, and I'm someone, again, I grew up near Appomattox. I volunteered when it was called the Museum of the Confederacy. I am much more interested in visiting the White House of the Confederacy, knowing that these are the stories that are being told.
Yeah.
These are the stories. I mean, we've done this research. Virginia Tourism has done this research. When we talk about what attracts visitors to these spaces, particularly Black travelers, stories of resilience, stories of achievement, stories of resistance. And that's the story that the White House Confederacy can tell, and tell in a very powerful way. And so I think ultimately, we have to, again, stop pretending as if we're trying to erase white history. That's not the goal. Really, frankly, that can't really happen. I mean, that's an unfounded fear. And when we elevate these stories, we have to ensure, again, that we're resourcing these stories. We aren't standing in the way, and necessarily we aren't putting up all these barriers, and let the stories be told by the people who can best tell them.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Y'all have been amazing, and you have said so many insightful things. I would love for the audience to ask any questions if you have them. Yes.
Can I just speak up?
You may. Yeah.
Sorry.
We can hear you.
I'm going to read from my notes. So what you just said was really great, so I just kind of want to talk to you, but everyone else. While listening, I couldn't help but think about the impermanence of the light-based projection artwork we're about to see, and sort of how you guys as record keepers, there's a permanence and an impermanence to history, because it's fleeting and it's held by our record keepers, right? So art
mean, well, you know, and I think we have the collections management team and the curators. I mean, I think they're in the audience right now. And you know, digitization isn't a saving grace by any means. I mean, ultimately, you still have to try your best to preserve these artifacts. But I think one thing that digitization does is it makes it more accessible to the artists who are out there who might not necessarily travel to a collections and to see something in person, but we never know how someone is going to be inspired by what they find. And when we make that more accessible through digitization, I think that's been talked about already on the stage, and it allows for new imaginations and interpretations to occur. So I think the more accessible we make the documentary evidence, the better, because we're able to reach audiences that might not consider themselves a history museum person, but yet are looking for inspiration and will find something online that sparks that inspiration.
What he said. I'm glad you asked that question. I now chair the education committee at the Executive Mansion. Justin has held that position before, and with each administration, the First Lady is the honorary chair, and with each administration, they decide what their focus and their initiative is. And this First Lady, Suzanne Youngkin, wants to focus on art. And there is artwork has been installed since she has arrived. And one of the things I mentioned in our meeting on Wednesday is that it would be good to have dog tags, those little citation notes beside the art, so that not only when people come to visit, they know who the artist is, the medium, when it was painted, maybe even the birth and death dates of the artist, but also to create a blog or a website so that it can be used by teachers and students to learn about not only the art in the Executive Mansion, but where this art comes from, because we will be looking at art from all over Virginia. And it gives people the opportunity to know what is in their community as well as what is on Capitol Square in the White House. So digitization, I think, is really the way to go.
I'm going to yes and what you both said, because I think those are great, because there's, to me, lots of strategies that make it more powerful to help explore those things. So making sure that there's access, making sure that the right tools are in the hands of educators, and that when we present art, we also present context to go with it, the stories that help inspire people. And I'm excited for Miguel's work, because I think it's going to be really interesting. It was making us ask questions and kind of imagine stories that go with it, and pairing that with what we know historically is really powerful. But when it comes to the history of the Civil War, I think pop culture has been a thing that has inspired new people to come to the stories, even if the stories they first experienced weren't always 100% accurate. It's okay. It opens a door and inspires curiosity, and then it's to those of us who, as you put it, are kind of record keepers, to help connect those, help answer those questions, and help tell all of these stories as essential to understanding who we are as a people. So women's history is everybody's history. Black history is everybody's history. This is knowing a complete history from so many different perspectives helps us understand the whole in so many more ways that are powerful, and connecting to those humans beyond just demographic similarities. So I think being able to think about it holistically and embracing those opportunities that inspire new interest are important.
And I'll just echo that thought on the power of art to inspire. Just the other day, we had a very large group of fourth graders. And it was the first time that I got to take them over to Browns Island since the new Emancipation Monument went up. And it was just incredible the way those children responded to the monument, because they were running around, they were excited. But then when they got to the monument and they sat down and they just looked up at it, there was this kind of awe. And and I asked the students, how does this make you feel? You know, what does this make you think about? And just hearing their responses to that. Everything from a little girl that says it makes me feel sad to a young African-American boy who said it makes me feel proud, it makes me think about freedom. So just the way the students responded to that just shows the power that art can have to tell a story.
I don't really know what to add. I come from artists, and so that the idea that we have these other ways of sort of processing the information and continuing to be able to, or being able to tap into things that were only possible to contemplate through interpretation without a lot of information to back it up. And I also think that it's going to always be very interesting and challenging to watch how artists interpret historical information, and because we have this idea that facts are facts, and we don't like them messed with very much. But I think that has to do with us wanting to be good record keepers, right? So that this information, the facts, are always there to be tapped into. But it is always interesting and important for us to encounter the way in which artists will take and interpret and explore themes and ideas in myriad ways. And the idea that some things are temporal, some things come into existence and then fade away very quickly, is also an important part of it. I don't think that anyone should think that art, it goes to the issue of monuments and the idea of sanctity and sacrosanctness of, just because it's a big piece of public art, we have this idea that it's supposed to exist forever. And the truth is that's never happened, ever in the history of humankind, first of all. And we also, it helps us remember that the art that is generated is a reflection of the time. It is a snapshot in many ways, and important for us to work with those just as much.
Can I just ask, like, what motivated that question, or what prompted, or is it something you're thinking about in particular?
I know she keeps smiling.
Oh, no, I mean, Alex is my partner,
Okay.
and so I know this is a question I would ask him, but I think it's more appropriate for our members of academia to get your opinion and, just get the relationship between the history and the art.
And maybe there needs to be more of a push for this type of interdisciplinary, collaboration, right? Because in academia, as you probably know, history and art do not overlap whatsoever. I mean, art history, of course, but if you're being trained as an artist, very rarely are you encountering those who are earning PhDs in history. But I think we have to encourage that collaboration more. Exactly what's happening tonight. History museums need to invite in artists and be able to build those connections, because I think in many ways art becomes a way to gain access to the archives. It piques that interest, the creativity around artistic expression. So I think what you all are doing right now is a wonderful example, and I hope we see more. There's some lines we have to break down, like even within the museum field. History museums and art museums don't always cooperate.
And I'll say that museums, we don't keep stuff just for ourselves because we like it. I mean, we do, but at the same time, we keep things, we're holding them as stewards for the public. In our case, we're a nonprofit. We don't pay tax because we're doing a service for the public. We're holding them for people to use and then to find meaning, to do research, to take inspiration and apply as they may see fit, to tell stories and ask questions with the public. But we're holding them for people to use, and if people are using it to inspire art, then that's amazing.
Absolutely. So we have 2 questions, 3, 4. All right. I felt like an octave. We got one question over there. All right. So let's go with you first.
So especially with like one of the videos tonight is about a woman that for a very long time was a spy. Like that's, she kept a
got one. I think if what I see a lot is because the people who created and advocated for the lost cause and were incredibly successful in graining that, and the way that it's evolved through time, because it's become so pervasive in our education system and in pop culture and just the way that so many of us have learned about it. And I'm from Michigan originally, and knowing more about the lost cause, I can see threads of that even in my own education. But I think one of the biggest things is being able to know what the lost cause is in a way that scholars agree that this is a system of a myth. It's not accurate to how scholars understand what actually happened. But being able to identify how that's shaped other things and being able to look at that lens, it's almost like, I don't know, the image in my head is those kind of images you had with a kid, and you had like the blue or the red glass or film that you put over something, and there's a hidden image underneath. But having that kind of translator to look at something, even if it's, when I first came to Virginia, I worked down at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, and a lot of the stories that people would talk about and how they remembered the founding of Jamestown also are colored by the lost cause. There's a lot of that in there too. So being able to identify those components and see that, and then when you see that, ask the question of, is that accurate? Or is this something that was colored by this system of thought? And how do I test that? How do I have my own historical literacy to test these things, to challenge the ways that those systems of thinking or that historical understanding is impacting how we're acting in the present? Does that make sense? But yeah, the ability to identify the lost cause in its current form and how that's impacted how we understand the world around us.
Thank you for that. All right, so I do apologize. We're not actually going to have time to get to any more questions, but if you do have questions, please stick around for the panelists, because I know y'all are antsy to see this amazing artwork that is going to be on the side of the Executive Mansion. So let's go ahead. I do want to give some final thanks. First, thank you all the panelists, for taking time to hang out with us, answer these amazing questions. Again, if you do have any follow-up questions. Yes. Thank you. And I want to thank the Mellon Foundation again, Culture Works, the Valentine Museum, the American Civil War Museum, Untold RVA, and lastly, Miguel Carter Fisher, for which you're about to see this in a minute. You'll just wait. It's amazing. And all right, so now if you could, we are going to head over to the White House of the Confederacy, and we have one word from Bill.
Yes, go that way
Yes,
first.
so
Go that way.
absolutely. So you're going to go
Now.
through there. You're going to make a right. And if you want to just go see it, the projection itself, go through here, make a right, make another right, and it's straight down. Thank you so much.